She is currently on the faculty of the MFA Writing Program at the New School and will be a visiting faculty member in the Graduate Writing Program at Columbia University. Please join me in welcoming Honor Moore to the Athenaeum.
Well, hello, everyone. I was thinking about being here, but sort of being in this architecture. I feel as if I might see Amy Lowell just right up there trying to reach the third shelf. She was 5'1". But, you know, the amazing thing is that we would not be here in this building this evening if it weren't for Amy Lowell. In I think it was 1903, somebody had the really bad idea of moving the Athenaeum across the public garden. And Amy Lowell, who was a shareholder then, took issue with that, along with a Miss Loring, who I think may have been Miss Catherine Loring, who was the friend of Alice James. In any case, they just thought this was a terrible idea, and Amy Lowell, who was quite forceful, purchased yet another share in the Athenaeum and sort of went to town and managed to prevent that from happening. So therefore, we're still here. And I'm here, and she's here. But I just wanted to start by reading. Amy Lowell was inspired first to love poetry by reading Keats via Leigh Hunt. And this rather long poem, The Boston Athenaeum, which I won't read all of, has the mark of Keats. And I'll just read a few lines just to situate us here with Amy. Miss Lowell. The Boston Athenaeum. Thou dear and well-loved haunt of happy hours, how often in some distant gallery, gained by a little painful spiral stair, far from the halls and corridors where throng the crowd of casual readers, have I passed long, peaceful hours, seated on the floor of some retired nook, all lined with books, where reverie and quiet reign supreme. Above, below, on every side, high-shelved from careless grasp of transient interest, stand books we can but dimly see, their charm much greater that their titles are unread. While on a level with the dusty floor, others are ranged in orderly confusion, and we must stoop in painful posture while we read their names and learn their histories. The little gallery winds round about the middle of a most secluded room, midway between the ceiling and the floor, a type of those high thoughts which, while we read, hover between the earth and furthest heaven, as fancy wills, leaving the printed page. For books but give the theme, our hearts the rest, enriching simple words with unguessed harmony. That is Amy Lowell being John Keats, but it's also Amy Lowell honoring the Boston Athenaeum, where actually she educated herself. She quit school at 16, and she read herself through her father's library and quite quickly, and then started in on the Athenaeum. And I suppose it's possible she read herself all the way through the Athenaeum. I'm going to be talking and reading a few of her poems, and I thought I'd start with a poem which is her most anthologized poem, Patterns. I walk down the garden paths, and all the daffodils are blowing, and the bright blue squills. I walk down the patterned garden paths in my stiff brocaded gown, with my powdered hair and jeweled fan. I, too, am a rare pattern as I wander down the garden paths. My dress is richly figured, and the train makes a pink and silver stain on the gravel and the thrift of the borders. Just a plate of current fashion, tripping by in high-heeled ribboned shoes, not a softness anywhere but me, only whalebone and brocade, and I sink on a seat in the shade of a lime tree. For my passion wars against the stiff brocade. The daffodils and squills flutter in the breeze as they please, and I weep, for the lime tree is in blossom, and one small flower has dropped upon my bosom. And the plashing of water drops in the marble fountain comes down the garden paths. The dripping never stops. Underneath my stiffened gown is the softness of a woman bathing in a marble basin, a basin in the midst of hedges grown so thick she cannot see her lover hiding. But she guesses he is near, and the sliding of the water seems the stroking of a dear hand upon her. What is summer in a fine brocaded gown? I should like to see it lying in a heap upon the ground, all the pink and silver crumpled up on the ground. I would be the pink and silver as I ran along the paths, and he would stumble after, bewildered by my laughter. I should see the sun flashing from his sword hilt and the buckles on his shoes. I would choose to lead him in a maze along the patterned paths, a bright and laughing maze for my heavy-booted lover, till he caught me in the shade, and the buttons of his waistcoat bruised my body as he clasped me, aching, melting, unafraid. With the shadows of the leaves and the sun drops and the plopping of the water drops all about us in the open afternoon, I am very like to swoon with the weight of this brocade, for the sun sifts through the shade. Underneath the fallen blossom is my bosom, is a letter I have hid. It was brought to me this morning by a rider from the Duke. Madam, we regret to inform you that Lord Hartwell died in action Thursday night. As I read it in the white morning sunlight, the letters squirmed like snakes. Any answer, madam? Said my footman. No, I told him. See that the messenger takes some refreshment. No answer, and I walked into the garden, up and down the patterned paths in my stiff, correct brocade. The blue and yellow flowers stood up proudly in the sun, each one. I stood upright too, held rigid to the pattern by the stiffness of my gown. Up and down I walked, up and down. In a month he would have been my husband. In a month here, underneath this lime, we would have broke the pattern. He for me and I for him, he as colonel, I as lady on this shady seat. He had a whim that sunlight carried blessing, and I answered, it shall be as you have said. Now he is dead. In summer and in winter, I shall walk up and down the patterned garden paths in my stiff, brocaded gown. The squills and daffodils will give place to pillared roses and to asters and to snow. I shall go up and down in my gown, gorgeously arrayed, boned and stayed, and the softness of my body will be guarded from embrace by each button, hook, and lace. For the man who should loose me is dead, fighting with the Duke in Flanders in a pattern called a war. Christ, what are patterns for? The scandalous thing about that poem when it was published was not so much the sexual fantasy as the word Christ as an epithet in the poem. And that poem is her most anthologized poem. I had not read it. I'd read some shorter poems when I was approached to do this book. So I really came to Amy Lowell new, except that I knew there was a kind of critical reputation that Amy Lowell had, which was invented by Ezra Pound and passed down the generations unexamined. So that as a woman poet myself, I didn't sort of look to Amy Lowell as an example. I'm going to just read a tiny bit from my introduction to the selected poems, which will give you an idea of that context. To utter the name Amy Lowell is to enter the fraught literary wars of early modernism. Almost immediately, we see an extremely short, extremely stout woman arguing forcefully with a young man with frizzy reddish hair and a goatee. The pince-nez on the woman's delicate nose looks tiny because her face is so enormous, and the young man is dressed in a velvet jacket. Never since the days of Wilde have such garments been seen on the streets of London, the woman will later report. At first, Amy Lowell and Ezra Pound admire each other, and then they hate each other, leaving paper trails to prove it. Imagism, someone shouts, baiting with Pound's vengeful epithet. To hear his partisans tell it, and his partisans come right down into the 20th, even 21st century, the principles of Imagism were Pound's genius, and Amy Lowell appropriated, even stole them. In fact, the British poet T.E. Hume first conceived the ideas, and Pound, ever restless, abandoned Imagism for vorticism as soon as he issued Des Imagistes of 1914, an anthology published in London of 6 poets, including himself, H.D., Richard Aldington, William Carlos Williams, and Amy Lowell. What caused the ruckus was that Lowell, inspired to bring the Imagist into print in America, edited 3 more anthologies, 1915, 16, and 17, in which Pound refused to be included. He'd selected and blue-penciled the poems in his collection, but Lowell invited contributors to choose their own poems and meticulously split the royalties. Democratized, Pound sneered. Thank you so much for the check for £8, which came today, wrote D.H. Lawrence, included in the 1916 anthology. Those Imagist books seem to blossom into gold like a monthly rose. Lawrence, who composed Women in Love on a typewriter Lowell gave him, became a lifelong friend, as did Robert Frost and Thomas Hardy, but we are never told the facts of Amy Lowell's literary life. And she smoked cigars. Yes, she did. Notably one night on shipboard, years before proper women did so in public and years before she'd published a poem. She refused a society interview on landing in New York. The indignant journalist found a witness, and the next morning, front pages all over America proclaimed that the sister of the president of Harvard smoked big black cigars. Actually, Lowell was a delicate woman, and her cigars were slender Manilas. Before long, her notoriety would come from her vocal defense of the new poetry, not from what she inhaled, and her fame from her writing rather than who her brother was. Her posthumous collection, What's a Clock, won the Pulitzer for Poetry in 1926, and her books, including her poetry collections, routinely reached bestseller lists. At the height of her career, Lowell was spending weeks each year touring, performing her poems to packed halls, and lecturing to hundreds. Young poets gathered at her feet, rapt as she held forth. Carl Sandburg likened the effect of her company to a bright blue wave. She also had a wicked sense of humor. Unwrapping one of her manillas was like undressing a lady, she told one young man. First, you remove the belt, the first cigar band, then the evening dress, the silver paper wrapping, the slip, the square of tissue paper, and finally the girdle, the second cigar band. So how did this woman, how did Amy Lowell become Amy Lowell? I want to just quickly outline that because it's such an extraordinary story. She was the sister, as I said, of Abbott Lawrence Lowell, who was the president of Harvard, and also of Percival Lowell, who not only wrote about the Orient, but actually built the Lowell Observatory in Arizona and had a hand in, well, wrote a book about the canals on Mars, the alleged canals on Mars, and also had a hand in locating Pluto. So she was from a very kind of big deal family, and she was the youngest. She was sort of a change of life baby. She was the youngest of the 5 children. There were also 2 sisters by 11 years. And her mother by that time was an invalid. She had Bright's disease. And the father was off in Lowell, Massachusetts, doing textiles. And she wandered. She wandered in his amazing garden at 7Ls in Brookline, and she wandered in his library, as I said. And she became a kind of solitary girl. This was added to by the fact that she was 5'1", and even her dear friend said almost as wide. She nonetheless did what a Boston Lowell daughter was supposed to do, which was to make her to go to Mr. Papanti's dancing school and to make her debut. And by that time, she could really dance well, and she was a gripping conversationalist, so she had a lovely time. But after that, she noticed, her friends were getting engaged and married, and this wasn't happening to her. Eventually, she did have an offer of marriage, and she did become engaged. And then suddenly, the man changed his mind, and Amy went into a deep but brief depression, and she emerged from her room, her lifelong bedroom on the top floor of 7Ls, and decided to undertake the regime of a diet doctor named Willard Banting, who was a British furniture maker turned diet doctor. I mean, he was the Atkins of his era. And she did this going up the Nile on a barge. And the regime was, you're not going to believe this, asparagus and tomatoes and nothing else eating. Needless to say, this broke her health, and after she recovered, she accepted herself. That is, she accepted her body, which turned out to be a glandular disorder that she couldn't do anything about. And she accepted that she was Amy Lowell. Well, the question was, what was Amy Lowell going to do with herself? The first thing she did was to join every committee. My favorite was the committee, it's something like the Committee to Prevent Excess Noise. This was in Brookline. And she also, her parents died. She bought her siblings out of 7Ls and settled in there and had musicals and theatricals, and she already had a passion for reading and the theater and poetry and music, but she wasn't writing. But it was a very fertile time artistically in Boston, and she was able to she knew Mrs. Gardner, and she went to musicals at on the Fenway, and she also came into the circle of Sarah Whitman, the painter and book designer and stained glass window designer, and arts and sort of the center of the arts and crafts aesthetic was in her salon. And she, you know, she was ripe for some kind of artistic revelation. And she went to the theater a lot, and she had actually been to see Duza perform a couple of times, but one day evening in 1903, she went to the new Tremont Theater, and Duza was performing plays written for her by Gabriele D'Annunzio, who had been her husband and had jilted her, and apparently these performances were amazing because she was a wreck. You know, she was throwing everything into her performances. And Amy had a kind of massive epiphany, and she went home and she just couldn't stop writing. She said, "I went to see her as I always went to see everything that was good in the theater. The effect on me was something tremendous. What really happened was that it revealed me to myself, but I hardly knew it at the time. I just knew that I had got to express the sensations that Duza's acting gave me somehow." Now, Lowell was not naive. She wrote later that her greatest handicap in becoming a serious writer was that she had come from a class that was not supposed to be able to produce creative work. And I write here in the introduction that in her 20s, she was doing just what artistic women of that class did, getting as close to the flame as possible without burning herself. And seeing Duza perform, she saw that to leap in could be an extraordinary thing. And what she did was to team up with her close friend, Bessie Ward, not lover or anything, but her dear friend, Bessie Ward, who was also an aspiring poet, and they systematically set about doing what we would now call having a writing group. They met, they wrote poems, they read them to each other. They made a commitment that they were not going to publish until they wrote something worthy. And this went on. And the Athenaeum poem that I read you was sort of part of the unworthy, it was an earlier work. But finally, in 1913, she had a poem accepted by the Atlantic Monthly, and that was sort of like having a poem accepted by the New Yorker now. It was an extremely big deal. And then she also, at the same time, had her first manuscript accepted by Houghton Mifflin. So she was just very excited. However, and so she was going through the whole process of having her proofs and seeing them, but she had a certain frustration about her life. She didn't really want to live a life alone. And she wrote in a diary right at that time, actually at 15, she'd written in a diary the following. "I feel very much in need of a very intimate friend, a friend whom I should love better than any other girl in the world, and who would feel so toward me, to whom I could tell all that is in my heart, and who would do so to me. We should love to be alone together, both of us." And I say here, Lowell had lived and written obedient to patterns of genteel formality, but she had ferocious hunger for the unpredictable experiences of intimacy and requited passion. She also was someone who had wonderful friendships. And during this time, she used to meet every week with a group of women friends. And once in a while, they would have a distinguished guest. And on this particular day, March 12th, 1913, the guest was an actress named Ada Dwyer Russell. Ada Dwyer Russell was the daughter of the man who had the only literary bookstore west of the Rockies for many years. It was in Utah. He was not a Mormon. And so she was a great reader. And she had been in Eleanor Robeson's troupe. And then Eleanor Robeson left the theater to marry August Belmont. And so Ada was sort of going from company to company, and she was in Boston in a play called The Deep Purple, which I didn't read, but this was, the play that Ada was in. And she came to this lunch, and immediately she and Amy Lowell began talking about poetry. And immediately Amy Lowell said, "Would you please come to dinner on your night off?" And so Ada came to 7L's to dinner on the Sunday night that she was off from the theater. And Amy Lowell read her the entire manuscript of Pictures of the Floating World, her first book of poems. A Dome of Many Colored Glass, which is her first book of poems. And apparently Ada thought it was wonderful. She thought there was one poem that should come out, and it was too late or something. But the point was that she won Amy's heart. And 2 years later, after sort of visits and so on, she left the stage and moved into 7L's. And at that point, she began to make Amy's life as a writer much easier. And Amy Lowell wrote from midnight until 6 or 7 in the morning. And then she would sleep, and she would wake up at 2 or 3, and she would do the sort of public Amy Lowell. And then there would always be there would often be a dinner party, and she would come down in time for the third course. She would keep everyone until 11:30, 11:45. Then she would go upstairs to this enormous library, which was actually probably the size of this room. And Ada would have made sure that there was a cold supper laid out for her for 3 in the morning or 4 in the morning, and that the sort of legion of secretaries had typed out all the scribblings from the night before into neat manuscripts. And Amy would work all night. And there's a very distinct division in Amy Lowell's work between what I call the public work, which Patterns is one of, and the Boston Athenaeum is one of, and there are many other examples, sort of history poems about Lord Nelson and Emma Hamilton, about Napoleon and Josephine. And then there are the poems written to Ada. And these are the poems which really represent her most significant work. I just want to talk a little bit about how she came into her specific voice. There, in 1912, 1913, when her first book was being published, there had been the first unbowdlerized Emily Dickinson had been published, A Single Hound. Pound's Des Imagistes was about to come out. Poetry magazine was publishing H.D.'s Imagist poems. And Pound had published Cathay, which was his book of versions of Chinese poetry. Amy's sensibility combined with the instruction of these three influences sort of suddenly brought her into her own voice. And so in the middle of the night, she was paying attention to what was going on outside in that garden where she'd spent her childhood. And I just want to, she, unlike many poets we could speak of, or many writers we could speak of, Amy Lowell was very acknowledging of Ada's contribution to her work. In fact, she said that she really wanted to have a sign made, which would say Lowell and Russell, makers of fine poems, and put it at the base of the driveway. So I'm just going to read a few of her poems so you get an idea. This first one I'll read is a kind of pure Imagist poem. And you'll just let yourself kind of see what she conjures here. The pike. In the brown water, thick and silver-sheened in the sunshine, liquid and cool in the shade of the reeds, a pike dozed. Lost among the shadows of stems, he lay unnoticed. Suddenly, he flicked his tail, and a green and copper brightness ran under the water. Out from under the reeds came the olive green light, and orange flashed up through the sun-thickened water, so the fish passed across the pool, green and copper, a darkness and a gleam, and the blurred reflections of the willows on the opposite bank received it. As you could hear from patterns, Amy Lowell was quite conscious of, for instance, the forces of war. And this is a poem called September 1918. This afternoon was the color of water falling through sunlight. The trees glittered with the tumbling of leaves. The sidewalks shone like alleys of dropped maple leaves, and the houses ran along them, laughing out of square, open windows. Under a tree in the park, two little boys, lying flat on their faces, were carefully gathering red berries to put in a pasteboard box. Someday, there will be no war. Then I shall take out this afternoon and turn it in my fingers and remark the sweet taste of it upon my palate and note the crisp variety of its flights of leaves. Today, I can only gather it and put it into my lunchbox, for I have time for nothing but the endeavor to balance myself upon a broken world. I was talking about the erotic poems that she began to write after she met Ada Russell. And this is one that was published in, of all places, Vanity Fair in 1919. The weathercock points south. I put your leaves aside, one by one, the stiff, broad outer leaves, the smaller ones, pleasant to touch, veined with purple, the glazed inner leaves. One by one, I parted you from your leaves until you stood up like a white flower swaying slightly in the evening wind. White flower, flower of wax, of jade, of unstreaked agate, flower with surfaces of ice, with shadows faintly crimson. Where in all the garden is there such a flower? The stars crowd through the lilac leaves to look at you. The low moon brightens you with silver. The bud is more than the calyx. There is nothing to equal a white bud of no color and of all, burnished by moonlight, thrust upon, by a softly swinging wind. One of the things about Amy Lowell's poems which moves me is a sense of a relationship to flowers and what we now call the environment that is much more intense than I think most people have now. I really have noticed in earlier American poetry this real sense of a kind of Eden. And it really is striking in Amy Lowell's poems. But she also had a sense of the urban. This is a poem called The Taxi. When I go away from you, the world beats dead like a slackened drum. I call out for you against the jutted stars and shout into the ridges of the wind, streets coming fast, one after the other, wedge you away from me, and the lamps of the city prick my eyes so that I can no longer see your face. Why should I leave you to wound myself upon the sharp edges of the night? And this is the bungler. You glow in my heart like the flames of uncounted candles. But when I go to warm my hands, my clumsiness overturns the light, and then I stumble against the tables and chairs. I was talking about the wicked sense of humor. There is also a sense in which Amy Lowell was not afraid to write poems of, well, you'll see, kind of social comment. And this is a slightly longer poem called The Dinner Party. The dinner party. Fish. So, they said, with their wine glasses delicately poised, mocking at the thing they cannot understand. So, they said again, amused and insolent. The silver on the table glittered, and the red wine in the glasses seemed the blood I had wasted in a foolish cause. Game. The gentleman with the gray and black whiskers sneered languidly over his quail. Then my heart flew up and labored, and I burst from my own holding and hurled myself forward. With straight blows I beat upon him. Furiously, with red-hot anger, I thrust against him. But my weapon slithered over his polished surface, and I recoiled upon myself, panting. Drawing room. In a dress, all softness and half-tones, indolent and half-reclined, she lay upon a couch with the firelight reflected in her jewels, but her eyes had no reflection. They swam in a gray smoke, the smoke of smoldering ashes, the smoke of her cindered heart. Coffee. They sat in a circle with their coffee cups. One dropped in a lump of sugar. One stirred with a spoon. I saw them as a circle of ghosts sipping blackness out of beautiful china and mildly protesting against my coarseness in being alive. Talk. They took dead man's souls and pinned them on their breasts for ornament. Their cufflinks and tiaras were gems dug from a grave. They were ghouls battening on exhumed thoughts, and I took a green liqueur from a servant so that he might come near me and give me the comfort of a living thing. 11 o'clock. The front door was hard and heavy. It shut behind me on the house of ghosts. I flattened my feet on the pavement to feel it solid under me. I ran my hand along the railings and shook them and pressed their pointed bars into my palms. The hurt of it reassured me. And I did it again and again until they were bruised. When I woke in the night, I laughed to find them aching, for only living flesh can suffer. two more poems. One of the things that's striking about Amy Lowell's love poems is the way in which they integrate a domestic life without sacrificing beauty. Madonna of the Evening Flowers. All day long I have been working. Now I am tired. I call. Where are you? But there is only the oak tree rustling in the wind. The house is very quiet. The sun shines in on your books, on your scissors and thimble just put down, but you are not there. Suddenly I am lonely. Where are you? I go about searching. Then I see you standing under a spire of pale blue larkspur with a basket of roses on your arm. You are cool like silver and you smile. I think the Canterbury bells are playing little tunes. You tell me the peonies need spraying, that the columbines have overrun all bounds, that the Pyrus japonica should be cut back and rounded. You tell me these things, but I look at you, heart of silver, white heart flame of polished silver, burning beneath the blue steeples of the larkspur, and I long to kneel instantly at your feet, while all about us peal the loud, sweet Te Deums of the Canterbury bells. Amy Lowell died at 51, and she had a long sort of condition which was brought about. She and Ada summered in Jaffrey, New Hampshire, and one day they were out and in a horse and buggy, and Amy was driving, and a storm was coming on, and the horse got scared and started to veer up a hill, and the wagon or the buggy, whatever it was, sort of fell into a ditch. So both of them got out, and Ada held the horse, and Amy, 5'1", lifted the wagon out of the ditch. She tore her umbilical muscles, and it was one of those things that was sort of not painful at first, but then developed into a condition, and she had 8 surgeries in the last 13 years of her life, or last 8, the last period of her life. And nothing ever did any good. And meanwhile, she was traveling around the country performing. She was, promoting the cause of the new poetry. She was writing essays. She wrote 10 volumes of poems, 1 volume of Chinese translations, 3 volumes of criticism, a 2-volume biography of Keats, all in 13 years. And one day, standing in that wonderful room of hers at the top of 7Ls, she saw her face, half of her face drop. And Ada was there, and she called Ada Peter. That was Ada's nickname. And she said, "Pete, a stroke." And she was dead an hour and a half later, 51 years old. And this is a poem she wrote quite a bit before that, and it's, I think, a good poem to close with. Penumbra. As I sit here in the quiet summer night, suddenly from the distant road there comes the grind and rush of an electric car, and from still farther off an engine puffs sharply, followed by the drawn-out shunting scrape of a freight train. These are the sounds that men make in the long business of living. They will always make such sounds, years after I am dead and cannot hear them. Sitting here in the summer night, I think of my death. What will it be like for you then? You will see my chair with its bright chintz covering standing in the afternoon sunshine, as now. You will see my narrow table at which I have written so many hours. My dogs will push their noses into your hand and ask, clinging to you with puzzled eyes. The old house will still be here, the old house which has known me since the beginning, the walls which have watched me while I played, soldiers, marbles, paper dolls which have protected me and my books. The front door will gaze down among the old trees where, as a child, I hunted ghosts and Indians. It will look out on the wide gravel sweep where I rolled my hoop, and at the rhododendron bushes where I caught black-spotted butterflies. The old house will guard you, as I have done. Its walls and rooms will hold you, and I shall whisper my thoughts and fancies, as always, from the pages of my books. You will sit there some quiet summer night, listening to the puffing trains, but you will not be lonely, for these things are a part of me. And my love will go on speaking to you through the chairs and the tables and the pictures, as it does now through my voice and the quick, necessary touch of my hand. Thank you. Thank you. I would be happy to answer a few questions if people have them. Yeah? Is 7L still standing? I myself have not been there, but Robert Pinsky told me that he and Frank Bedart had actually been to dinner there, and it is standing. However, the top floor, which was Amy's room, which she called the Sky Parlor, was taken off, presumably for heating issues. But apparently it is still there. Yes? Imagist poetry, the idea was to, I'm sorry that I didn't do that. The idea, it's coming out of the 19th century, which is a very rhetorically rich and complicated and metrical kind of poetry. And the idea was to kind of get rid of the ornament and go straight for the image, the speech, the clarity, the directness. It was a real revolution in poetry, which is still going on, and actually the conflict between the metrical poets and the Imagist poets is still very much happening. But it was that, you could hear it in the most purely in that poem, The Pike, about the fish. The idea was to make the language be the picture, be the image, without, excess of rhetoric. Is that... Yes? How did I select the poems for this volume? Amy Lowell's, this is Amy Lowell's complete poetical works, and it's 550 pages, double columns. I read it twice, and then I had then I sort of picked 3/4 of it, and I had it Xeroxed and enlarged so that it would be slightly easier to read. And, I just read it 7 or 8 times, over and over and over again, choosing poems and, going back over and choosing poems. And I had a limit on the number of poems, and I made certain rules. I decided I didn't want to excerpt. So there are some long pieces, like a critical fable, which is her kind of very funny, very witty, kind of anonymously published sort of commentary on the critical context of poetry at the time. There are long prose poems. She was a pioneer of the prose poem. There are long historical prose poems, which she called cadenced verse. And I've included a couple of longer pieces in the selection, but I decided, as I said, not to excerpt. So I just kind of tried to pick what spoke to me, and what represented her. And there was an issue about whether to include some of the Chinese translations. For instance, she translated the poem that Pound published as The River Merchant's Wife, which is a famous poem of his. And she, it is a great poem, but she took issue with he did versions, she did translations with a friend of hers who had grown up in China and lived there. And that woman did the literal translations, and made them into poems, and they went back, the poems went back and forth on ships to China, and anyway, I thought it was important to include those. So it was, as a process, and it sort of became clearer the more I knew about her life. And there is this fantastic book, if you're truly obsessed with Amy Lowell. It must be 800 pages long. It's called Amy Lowell, A Chronicle and Letters and Reviews or Criticism or something. Anyway, it's sort of like an encyclopedia of Amy Lowell. And once I read that and another biography, then I had another sense of what poems. Yes?
You talked about Ezra Pound, and I think of Gertrude Stein. Did they know each other?
I don't think they ever met. In fact, they did not meet, and they didn't really dig each other, let's just put it that way. I mean, it's odd because they were, born the same year, and in certain ways, profoundly influential. But I think Gertrude kind of looked down on Amy, and Amy kind of looked down on Gertrude. But there was no affinity. There was no interest in meeting. And of course, Gertrude Stein didn't sort of become Gertrude Stein until later. Amy Lowell was already Amy Lowell before Gertrude Stein was Gertrude Stein, if you know what I mean. And Amy Lowell was dead in 1925, so Gertrude was just gearing up then. Yes? That part of the question is, did Amy and Russell overlap with Willa Cather there? I don't know, but it certainly was a kind of artist's part of the world. And Amy Lowell, I'm here sort of from the MacDowell colony, and Amy Lowell did go over to the MacDowell colony, and she knew the MacDowells, and I am sure, I don't know, but I'm sure that if the years corresponded, that they did know each other. Yes? What became of Ada after Amy's death? She had a life interest in the house, and she was taken care of, financially, and she spent the rest of her life really looking after Amy Lowell's, making sure the books got published, making sure the money got properly given away, making the gift of the books to the Harvard Library, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. She sort of, that's what she did. And I think she outlived her by quite a while. I don't remember exactly how long, but quite a while. Yes?
What's her relationship with her two brothers and either sisters?
What was Amy Lowell's relationship with her? Her brothers were very supportive. Percival was her kind of favorite brother. That's the Orientalist astronomer brother. And he right after she started to write, he wrote to her and he said, now, remember that the only reason people read books is if it's interesting. So just make sure your books are interesting. And her Harvard professor brother really, they were very supportive of her. And one of the most touching sort of sequences in the Foster Damon biography is when she got, I don't remember what medal, she got some sort of award from Harvard. And that was a great moment, with her brother, because she got it on her own steam, as it were. And one of her sisters sort of brought her up, since the mother was sick, one of the sisters was sort of in charge of this wild Tom girl boy. But I think it was a kind of happy family, is my sense. And certainly the fact that Amy Lowell managed to be so successful and happy in her life relatively, at last, seems to bear that notion out. Yes? Is there a portrait you can see in the Museum of Fine Arts? I don't know, but there's a photograph in the front of this charming book, which maybe you can purchase later and look at. Except that I'm not wild for the picture in this book. This picture in this book is kind of grande dame. And I wanted a picture. There's a wonderful picture of her wearing a suit, and she's picking a flower. She's sort of bent over in a garden picking a flower, but somehow, the email didn't get to the publisher, so we ended up with this picture. But, and there are various famous pictures of her sort of sitting in a chair with the little glasses on her nose, but I love this one. So I want you to picture her in this tweed suit with her hair up, picking a flower. Any, yes? The book Six French Poets is just wonderful, and I read in a book of hers called Tendencies in Modern Poetry, which is sort of about Robert Frost and Edward Arlington Robinson and so on, and I liked it well enough, and I had dinner with Susan Sontag. And she, what are you doing, blah, blah, blah. And I said, Amy Lowell. And she said, I love Amy Lowell. Well, this was a big shock, And I said, why? And she said, well, when I was a girl in Los Angeles, I went to the library, and there was this dark blue book called Six French Poets. And it's the first time I knew about French poets. And she said, I still have the book here somewhere. She had 8 million books, so I got my own copy. But that is a wonderful book. And I gathered that the Keats biography is also quite interesting. What she does is to kind of retrieve Fanny Braun from being a harridan and the person who destroyed Keats's life, and makes her into actually the heroine of Keats's life. But I haven't read that. Way in the back? Yes. Yes, the apparent animosity, we'll just say the actual animosity between Amy Lowell and Ezra Pound. When he first met her, she came to London, where he was, with a letter of introduction from Harriet Monroe. And she presented the letter of introduction, and she actually had a couple of dinner parties at the hotel where she was staying. And, le tout Imagist came to the dinner. And he actually wrote to people that he quite liked her. But then she was an enthusiast, and she was, I didn't mention this, it's in the introduction, but her idea of how you did things was sort of the way Pauline Agassiz Shaw did settlement houses, Elizabeth Perkins did Elizabeth Peabody did kindergartens, and Lucy Stone did suffragism. So, she was into this Imagist thing, and she was doing these anthologies, and it just pissed him off. And I think that she was a powerful woman. She had a great sense of entitlement. She was a Lowell, and she had a great sense of entitlement. This is part of what came out of this family. And also she was a lesbian. I mean, she was not, a shrinking violet. And, there came to be a natural animosity. And poets notoriously are feud. It still goes on, and it's always gone on since, the Greeks. But the thing that's interesting about this is that Ezra Pound was so powerful. He sort of created the modernist canon, and he declared and declaimed, and he lived much longer than Amy Lowell lived. And then he had this fantastic advocate, critic, Hugh Kenner, who, repeated everything he said. And the book about Hugh Kenner was much more important than Foster Damon on Amy Lowell. And I just think of it as like a ship container, all that stuff that Pound said is sealed in this ship container. It says, Amy Lowell's critical reputation. It's passed down through the generations without anybody opening it up to see what's in there. So, maybe one more question? Maybe there aren't any more. Okay, thank you very much.